My friends, I would like to wish Chronia Pola to all of you who celebrate Orthodox Easter this past Sunday, yesterday. Christos Anesti, with health, which is above everything else in the times we are living, and safety for all of you and your families. My name is Alexandra Papadopoulou. I speak to you from Washington, D.C. I am the Greek ambassador to the United States. In partnership with the Hellenic American Leadership Council, the Embassy of Greece in the United States is pleased to bring to you the week-long series, Thermopylae and Salamis, the battles that saved Western civilization. As you are aware, this year we commemorate the 25th centennial of those two great battles. At the launch of the celebratory series of events for this 25th centennial, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis noted the words of historian Vasilis Panayotopoulos, who wrote that in our time, people are turning again to the past, with history taking on a therapeutic role. And if that expresses an internal tendency of social self-awareness in search of ourselves, then it is truly something positive. The Prime Minister uttered these words before the coronavirus crisis. They were insightful then, but they are more even insightful today. So despite the need to stay home, technology has given us a way to continue our celebration of Thermopylae and Salamis. And by the way, celebration, when I say the word celebration, I mean something much deeper than commemoration of the bravery of the people who fought, the strategic genius of their leaders. It's something more than paying tribute to them. It's a good opportunity for all of us to delve into deep historical and philosophical human questions, which affected the paths we took in life and history, our political systems, our values, our way of life. These questions are more pertinent today in the crisis we're facing than ever before. So I will use the technology to travel to Cambridge and start this series in the most appropriate way by bringing Professor Paul Cartledge, the Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge, and a presidential appointee to the Hellenic Republic's Honorary Committee on the anniversary year. Professor Cartledge, thank you for joining us. And to guide this conversation, I turn it over to Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council, Andy Zemenidis. Andy, your turn.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's our great privilege and honor to work with the Greek Embassy and with you. You're right, this is a celebration. And Christos Anesti to all who have celebrated. And I am thrilled this week, the whole celebration, we get to feature three of my favorite authors and historians, and to start
You've frozen, Andy. Andy is frozen.
Am I back?
You're back now.
All right.
Yes.
Sorry for the technical mishap. But as I was saying, I'm thrilled to join with my good friend, Professor Paul Cartledge, who the ambassador talked about all his wonderful qualifications, but one of my favorite right here, his book on Thermopylae. We're going to get into specific questions, but if you really want to celebrate this historic battle, you got to pick up the book. He does a great job not only of getting through Greek historical sources, but even Persian sources. And I will say that the true and full history of Thermopylae is even more impressive than the legend and even the movie 300. So, Paul, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your work. And thank you for, again and again, bringing Thermopylae to life.
Well, let me thank you, Andy, for inviting me, and may I echo the ambassador's very inspiring and very charming opening statement. Happy Easter, happy Greek Easter, and to all our Hellenic American friends, hello from Cambridge.
So, set the stage for us, Professor. You know, Thermopylae, we're focusing on Thermopylae, and Thermopylae is certainly a famous battle, but it is a battle. And it was one of many battles in the Persian Wars, and famous battles, Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, Artemisium, they all played a role. In fact, I could argue that these Persian wars, that 10-year period, was the ancient world's equivalent of World War I and World War II. What would you say to that in that type of context?
Thank you for framing it in that very, very interesting way. I'd start off, of course, by saying that by world, the ancient Greeks would have had a much smaller conception than we today in the 20th or 21st century. There was a very wide Greek world, and it extended into Asia, into Africa, and as well, of course, as being based around the Aegean in Europe. But it's very important to remember there was something like 1,000 Greek cities. We, of course, are most familiar with Athens, with Sparta, and they were indeed protagonists in these Persian wars. But we've got to remember our Greek friends in Asia who were actually part of the Persian Empire. It's very important to remember that though the Persians attacked Greece, and that's what we mean by the Persian Wars, because it's looked at from the Greek side, so it's Greeks against Persians. Nevertheless, the Persians had lots and lots of Greeks in their empire, and they brought quite a lot of them along with them when they made their very major invasion. And you mentioned the Battle of Marathon. Well, that's the precondition for the Battle of Thermopylae in this sense. The Battle of Marathon was won famously by the Athenians. Why did the Persians invade? Because the pesky Athenians had had the temerity to intervene in what the Persians considered their sphere, which is Asia. Persian Empire is about 50 years, 60 years old, founded middle of the 6th century, Cyrus the Great, based in Iran. Quickly spread west, all the way to the Aegean, quickly spread east, all the way to what's today Pakistan, Afghanistan. Well, in the early part of what we call the 5th century, BC, in the early 490s, a bunch of Greek subjects decided they wanted out. They'd had enough of being subject to an alien power, which they thought intervened too far into their life, which was too alien culturally. They wanted to be free as they imagined their Greek cousins on the other side of the Aegean were. Well, now the Athenians, if you like, made a mistake, but on the other hand made a very brave mistake. They agreed to support the Greeks rising up in Asia against the Persians. And it was a very, very long struggle, about 6 years. The Athenians actually torched one of the Persians' provincial capitals in Western Asia. So the big invasion, the one we're interested in tonight, is the direct result of the desire for revenge. Battle of Marathon was their first attempt at revenge. They lost. Then they came back. And as you rightly said, it's about a decade between Marathon and between the first of the major battles, which is Thermopylae, in about August 480 BC or BCE.
You know, you refer to the protagonists in the Persian Wars. And of course, when it comes to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans are one of the protagonists. And despite how legendary this battle has become, it's striking how little people know about the Spartans. Another commercial for you, another one of my favorites, your book, The Spartans, which, if I'm correct, the BBC documentary was based on this book. Your first chapter in this book is actually about Lycurgus.
Right.
And I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about Lycurgus and tell us how different a world or a Thermopylae or even in ancient Greece we would know but for Lycurgus.
Right, well, let me just go back a little bit. I said that there was a whole Greek world, of which there were about 1,000 Greek cities. Well, there were about 700 of them in the Aegean area, in other words, directly affected by the Persian Empire, by the Persians' attempt at conquest of mainland Greece. Of those 700, only about 32 were bold enough or resolute enough or foolish enough to decide to resist. In other words, most Greeks in the Aegean either stayed neutral or, and very sadly, some of them actually went over to the Persian side as the Persians advanced. So we're left with a core led by, on the one hand, Sparta, on the other hand, Athens. They swore that they would resist. They swore a religious oath of union and unity. They called themselves simply the Hellenes, the Greeks. Well, why Sparta? Because it wasn't Sparta that the Persians were really angry with, but Athens. Well, the reason was Sparta was the leader of the Greeks. It was the most important, the most single powerful military state on land. And the Persians were going to invade by land or by sea. So what sort of a funny state, and I put it this way deliberately, what sort of a peculiar state was Sparta? Well, it's based, of course, as those of you know, down in the Peloponnese. But whereas most cities of Greece just had a relatively small territory and only a few thousand citizens and a few thousand dependents, people living within the city area, the Spartans occupied almost half of the Peloponnese, and they had within their territory two different sorts of subordinate populations, and that's very extraordinary. So you've got first the Spartans. They've gone through a particular educational system which they attributed to Lycurgus. Excuse me. Lycurgus is their, if you like, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, and whoever you like to think of among the founding fathers of America rolled into one. He was attributed with the Constitution, the educational system, the economic system, you name it. So if you were a Spartan, you were, as it were, one of the sons of Lycurgus. And what was distinctive, or at least what the Greeks thought was distinctive, was that beneath the Spartans, as a military state, they controlled a whole bunch of unfree Greeks, whom they called helots. Helots means captives, and there were many more helots than there were Spartans. So it seems that the Spartans became military after conquest in order to survive. They were a sort of embattled minority in a funny way. And then in between Spartans on the one hand, the full Spartan citizens, helots on the other, was an intermediate group called the, well, in Greek, periiki, which means something like dwellers round about. They're free. They have civic rights in their own towns and cities, but they don't have a say in the domestic or foreign policy of Sparta. So the Persians invade in the late 480s, 480. Sparta has to decide what to do. It's leading a Greek resistance. Well, Sparta's odd in a number of ways. One of them is in having more than one king. They were actually ruled, formally speaking, by kings from two separate royal houses. One of those kings had only recently come to the throne. There'd been a bit of a kerfuffle in Sparta, and a king had actually been deposed and sent into exile. Not only that, he was actually with Xerxes. He'd actually gone over to Xerxes' side. How do we know this? Well, we know mostly because of Herodotus, who is the historian, the first actually historian of Greece, the first historian of the world in a way. And so it's due to him that we can even start to talk about the Persian Wars, the Battle of Thermopylae, and so on. So we have a situation in which the other king of Sparta is a man of about 60. He's called Leonidas in modern Greek, Leonidas in English, Leonidas to you Americans. And he is very determinedly a resistor. There is no question in his mind. Sparta has one and only one option, which is to resist. And he is actually, I think, the man leading the Spartans' policy making at this particular time. And it's due to him that the nature of the Spartan force at Thermopylae is as strange as it is. And would you like me to talk about that right now, or would you like me to come back to that a little bit later?
Yeah, no, I would like you to talk about that and maybe expand a little bit on Leonidas, because you know, the legend and the myth, you know, shows him as the only king. Yes. The movie does as well. Right. He is a big part of the legend. He also, his ultimate sacrifice and what happened at Thermopylae seems to have changed history's view of him.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that, and then and the policy-making structure.
So in Sparta, the word leon, as in modern Greek, of course, means lion. And Leonidas means descendant of lion. And there was a very early king of Sparta called Leon Lion. So he is, we have in English Richard the Lionheart, Richard I. Leonidas was Leonidas the Lionheart. He wouldn't, when he was born, have expected to become king, because an older half-brother of his was king. He was actually born to the second wife of his father. And so his father had an older son who preceded him as king. But that older son died in about 490, about the time of Marathon. So Leonidas becomes king because he's the oldest of the three half-brothers of the previous king. He, therefore, because he wasn't expected to be king, he will have gone through the normal Spartan education. Sparta was unique in Greece in having a comprehensive, compulsory educational system. From the age of 7 up to the age of 18, all Spartan boys were rigorously trained, mainly physically. They learnt their letters, they learnt their writing and so on. They could read and write, but primarily speaking, they were introduced to the military life from a very, very young age. They were, as it were, destined to be Spartan soldiers. That was what being a Spartan was. So Leonidas, and this is very important, I think, was more like other Spartans than you would normally expect a king to be. We in England have this funny, as you know, constitutional monarchy. Well, Prince Charles, Crown Prince, he's not going to be like your average Englishman, but Leonidas was like your average Spartan. So, as I say, he had to wait a long time to become king, and he wouldn't have expected to be king. And the reason he became king is that his older brother, half-brother, had only a daughter, no son, so no heir. At any rate, Leonidas was about 60 when, having realized the Persians are coming and the Greeks united, Athens, Sparta, about 30 allies decide they must resist Xerxes' invasion, which is coming by land and by sea. Well, the first feasible line of defense strategically, which is linkable with a position at sea, in other words, between the army and the fleet, is the Thermopylae Pass, which links with the situation at the north of the island of Euboea, or Evia in modern Greek. So Leonidas takes a task force, specially chosen, just 300. Now, Herodotus is very useful here. We know that normally in Sparta and in battle, normally, the Spartan king, each of them, 2 of them, had a bodyguard, a special royal elite force, as it were the paras or the marines, who numbered 300. So you might think, oh, okay, so he's going off to Thermopylae and he's taking the 300 that he's normally got as his royal bodyguard. No. He selects a special task force of men who all are married and have a son. I think this is a clue. Why would you want to be sure that if the guy who's going to Thermopylae dies, that he has a son and heir, if you weren't expecting him to die at Thermopylae? Why only 300? Why not take more? Well, there were problems. This was at the time of the Olympic Games. This was at the time of a religious festival, and the Spartans were fiercely religious, where strictly you shouldn't fight at all. It was one of those periods of religious quietism. It's the time of the Carnaia in honor of Apollo. So anyway, he takes 300, but he also takes some perioikoi, people I mentioned, and with him, he has under him something like 6,000 to 7,000 other Greeks, allies, some from the north, mainly from the south, from the Peloponnese, where he's from.
You know, I want to talk a little bit about the villains here.
Right.
The villains in the story, the Persians. You have a marvelous discussion in the book about the dynasty that Darius and then Xerxes hail from, that were the combatants in the Persian wars. But I want to get into a little of a what if, because your book and history in general seems to suggest that the Persians serially underestimated the Greeks. They underestimated the Athenians at Marathon, and they severely underestimated the Spartans. Early in your book Thermopylae, you actually you note a conversation by Cyrus, who, he called the Spartans like cheap traders or merchants, and you point out that this showed complete ignorance of the Spartans. And of course, then the Persians didn't get to face or directly face off with the Spartans for another 60 years, whereas I believe history showed us the Spartans went and really studied the battlefield of Marathon and all the rest. Did we luck out at Thermopylae because of this Persian hubris, lack of preparation? If the Persians took the Spartans a little more seriously, might Thermopylae have turned out differently?
Right, that's a very, very good question. That sort of what if. Well, first of all, I have to let viewers and listeners into a little bit of a secret. I'm sure it's not a secret, but of course the Battle of Thermopylae was a defeat for the Greek defenders. It's one of those rare defeats which are transformed by what happens after and by what people think about it after into a moral victory. So it is a kind of victory, but militarily speaking, it is actually a defeat. So it's not until later, in fact, the following year, Battle of Plataea, that the Spartans are able to exhibit their training, their discipline, their courage, their desire for independence from a foreign power on the battlefield of Plataea in central Greece, in Viotia, in Boeotia. So the Persians, you're quite right, got Marathon wrong. They got other battles, Salamis and Plataea, wrong. They probably did overestimate their ability to win. They had pretty good reason for thinking they would win by a walkover, namely, they had vast numbers. I've already mentioned that the Greeks managed only 32 out of the 700 cities to unite, to physically resist. And the other Greeks were in a bit of disarray. They were not sure what to do. Xerxes might well have felt these disagreements among the Persians. It's much easier to beat a disunited enemy than it is to beat a resolute, united one. So not only were the Greeks disunited, they were very, very much fewer. Altogether, a Greek army might be able to put into the field, if they all united together, and they did actually manage this at Plataea, of the order of 80 to 100,000, absolute maximum. Well, the Persians, if you believe Herodotus, I don't actually, but he thought they had 5 million. Well, now that's wildly exaggerated, but the fact is they probably came by land between 100 and 200,000, And by sea, they brought, let's say, 1,200 ships, which is twice as many, maybe 3 times as many as the Greeks could put into the water at any one time. And each of those warships had something like 200 men on it. So 200 by all those 1,000 ships, 1,200. We're talking about many, many more Persians and subjects. Of course, not all ethnic Persians, Iranians, but subjects of Persia. So we're faced with the situation where the Greeks very sensibly decide to defend the narrowest and the toughest, the most sort of defensible pass in northern Greece, just south of Thessaly, coming into focus, coming into Marlis. And it's about 1 kilometer long, but it's very, very narrow. And so you might say, why didn't Xerxes go round it? Well, the fact is that would have been a real pain, because there are lots of mountains round there. And it's actually though there are other passes, it is possible to take other routes, not for a large army. That's why he wanted to go through Thermopylae, as indeed other Romans, others have gone through it. The Germans in the 1940s, Thermopylae is the main route into central and southern Greece from the north by land.
You talk, and I want to remind our viewers that Professor Cartledge has agreed to take some of your questions, so type them in, and I will get it to him. We actually have one that deals from Justin Litterford a little bit with the numbers you talked about, and you have pointed out, his question is, did Greeks cooperate with the Persians on subjugation? I think you've pointed out on multiple occasions that even at Thermopylae, there may have been more Greeks on the Persian side than there were defending, and as part of the Spartan alliance. But going to your point about Herodotus, let's talk about the battle itself. Herodotus, it seems to be a matter of consensus now, certainly over-exaggerated the Persian force and what the Spartans were facing. But despite that exaggeration, the Spartans and their allies certainly faced the longest odds that history had ever shown, or at least until that point. What was the Spartan strategy and to a lesser extent the tactics that made this battle the battle that we still discuss 2,500 years later?
Well, scholars are not absolutely certain amongst themselves, and Herodotus is not at his best in bringing out the underlying strategy, that is the amphibious, land, sea together resistance. He's not at his best there. But scholars can't agree whether Leonidas thought, or whether the allies thought, that his force, 300 Spartans, maybe 1,000 perioikoi, maybe 6,000 to 7,000 other Greeks. Was that an advance force? That was one view, that there would be, in other words, many more reinforcements once the Olympics were over, once the Carnaia was, and so on and so on. Or was it merely a holding operation anyway? So you don't want to lose too many. You want to make a big point. We are not going to be frightened by you, Xerxes. We're going to resist you, and we're going to fight tooth and nail. But we're probably, they say to themselves, mostly going to have to die. Or if not most of us, we're going to hold them up, but then we're going to have to melt away. We can't hold them up for very long. Well, what actually happened was Xerxes comes along at the west end of the pass. It's an east-west pass. And he waits there, assuming that the Greeks will melt away, or that there will be a traitor, or, there's some reason why he hopes that he will be able to get through Thermopylae without a battle. And that will be psychologically, for him, a terrific victory. If somebody simply refuses to fight, if they flee, then the invading force has the initiative from the word go. So after 3 or 4 days of waiting, and the Greeks under Leonidas not going at all, showing every sign of resistance. Then finally Xerxes sends in some, not his very, very best, but some of his best troops. They are actually Asian troops, they're non-Greek, and he sends them in. But the Spartans lead the resistance. We've got to remember this is a very narrow pass. So at any one time, Xerxes can't make his numbers tell. He's got a mixed force, partly infantry, partly light infantry, that is archers, slingers, and he can't, of course, use his cavalry, which actually for Persians is the primary crack force on an open battlefield. So this for the Persians is not their ideal scenario. First day, the Spartans actually inflict more casualties on the Persians. I mean, possibly even 5-figure casualties, because Xerxes sends in relays. The first lot are killed. He sends in another bunch, the next, and so on. And according to Herodotus, well, Herodotus may be biased. Some of the Persian side are not exactly keen to go in and get killed. They have to be whipped in. And this is part of a bigger ideological distinction. And I should have said earlier that one way in which this is a bit like the Second World War, not like the First World War, it is a culture war. It is a war of civilizations. And the Greeks see themselves as free politically, fighting against a despotism of the Persians, who are alien in this political way. Anyway, maybe or maybe not, Xerxes has to whip some of his men. So day one, to the Spartans. Day two, according to Herodotus, ditto. The same thing happens, that the Persians are not making significant headway. And then it's on the night of day two of the actual battle that the turning point comes. And you can ask me about that.
Well, you know, the turning point, I want to get to another what if, right? Because as we forward, you know, as you said, the Spartans were in, you know, giving 5-figure casualties to the Persians. The fight scenes are legendary, even in the movie. You have the immortals. It doesn't seem that they can break through the Spartans and their allies, and then we have one of history's top villains appear. We've immortalized the name Ephialtes. If we remember at the end of the 300, Leonidas wishes him, may you live forever, and he does, because every time we have a nightmare, we say we've had an Ephialtes. What if there wasn't an Ephialtes, or if Xerxes thought it was a trick and executed him instead of taking the intelligence? Does Thermopylae, under any scenario, turn into an unqualified victory rather than a defeat?
It doesn't. Herodotus, very interestingly, he mentions 3 names, that there were 3 people alleged to have been the traitor, but that his view coincided with the Spartans' view, which is that it was Ephialtes, because it was Ephialtes on whom a contract was taken out after the Persian wars were over, and he was murdered, and the Spartans acknowledged that he was the real traitor. But it's very important to remember that the pass which Ephialtes told Xerxes about, actually that would have sooner or later leaked out from someone, because Leonidas knew very well that there was this very difficult pass above and behind him, so that if you could get behind him and enter the pass from the east as well as the west, you would then pincer the Greeks, the Spartans and the other Greeks in the Thermopylae pass. Well, Leonidas knew about this pass because he had already posted a local detachment, 1,000 men of focus, precisely to either prevent any Persian force getting past them, or at any rate to alert the Spartans well in advance that there was this force coming. So I can't imagine that it would have been very long. Xerxes would have from the start have been asking, Is there another way around? And somebody surely would have come forward. And this is where I'm afraid that Greek, what shall we say, Greek, not brilliant interaction comes into play, because the man Ephialtes was not from Phocis. Mm-hmm. Phocians were determined, all of them, against Leonidas, against Xerxes. They were pro-Greek, they were resistors, they were loyalists. But he was from Marlis, and possibly because he didn't like the Phocians, or because he shared the views of most Greeks, probably, that the Greeks were going to lose. Eventually, sooner or later, they were going to lose. We've got to think away Salamis. We've got to think away Plataea. This is very early on. So, at any rate, Ephialtes allegedly, and probably, tells Xerxes, and Xerxes now does not make the mistake he made before. He sends the best troops overnight across the Anapaya Pass. And the Greeks called these people immortals. They're his royal bodyguard, Xerxes' royal bodyguard, 10,000. And the Greeks believed that as soon as one was killed, there would be another one immediately replacing that one, so that the number 10,000 was kept constant. Actually, the Persians called them something like apple bearers, not immortals. At any rate, the leader of the immortals, Hydarnes, he goes over the pass and indeed just walks past. He waltzes past the Phocians, who don't realize they're past until they're past. I mean, it's really chronic. Though you could imagine, I suppose, there is a certain element of fear on the part of the Phocians. It looks just like incompetence. But at any rate, Hydarnes and his immortals do go round, and therefore they do pincer what Greeks are left of the original 6,000 to 7,000. By this time, very, very many fewer. We're down to just the survivors of the 300, the survivors of the Perioikoi, the survivors of the Thespians, which is a city in central Greece, Thespies, and we have some Thebans also. Now, I haven't mentioned up to this point, it's a little bit embarrassing, but Thebes was on the enemy side. Thebes had gone over to the Persians. So there are Thebans fighting with Leonidas, but were they fighting voluntarily? Were they fighting as hostages? Or who knows?
You know, we talk about the military defeat, right? And you could argue that since we talked about the difference between tactics and strategy, it could have been a tactical defeat, maybe a strategic victory, right? At the end, the Plataea scene in the movie 300, where the Spartan captain says, "I didn't understand why my king spoke of victory until now." And there's a famous cartoon from World War II when the Greeks were resisting the Nazis. It was a side-by-side picture of the Spartans resisting the Persians at Thermopylae 480 BC, and then the Greeks resisting the Axis forces and saying Thermopylae, 1941. And as you know, as we've heard Churchill and Roosevelt saying, the Greeks gave the world a look at, or the belief that they could stand up to the irresistible and unbeatable Axis monster. Is that ultimately the legacy of Thermopylae? You know, Leonidas, did he know, we're going down, but people are going to believe that we can beat these if we...
Exactly right, Andy. And there is, in fact, a bit of ancient evidence. It's an oracle from the Oracle of Delphi, which normally had been actually pretty much pro-Persian, or at least rather defeatist, shall we say. But one of them allegedly said, one oracle, if a Spartan king dies, then Sparta, its territory, will not be ravaged by the Persians, and victory eventually will go. Well, now, Leonidas made a big thing of that. There are also wonderful sayings which come out of this particular episode, and one of them is perhaps a little bit less reputable now than it was. Molon Laba, we can talk about that. Another one was a Spartan was told, the Persians have so many archers that when they shoot all together, the sky is darkened. And he replies, great, we will fight them in the shade. And the third one, in a way, I like this the best. These are all probably made up to some extent. Leonidas is with just his handful of survivors on the final third day, and they're going to go down to their deaths. So he says to his troops, men, eat a hearty breakfast, because tonight we will dine in Hades. Well, now, if you know your Homer, the Greeks had the view that in Hades, spirits were just like ghosts. They didn't actually eat normal food. So it's a typically Spartan saying, a gallows humor. And it is that do or die, that we will never surrender, they shall not pass mentality, which is partly Spartan, because the Spartans were indeed bred in a way to believe that to die a soldier's death in the cause that you believe in, that was the highest form of death for a man. It guaranteed you a good memory. And Greeks were very keen on, it sounds a bit macabre and morbid, but how you die mattered almost as much as how you had lived up to that moment. So Leonidas and his 300 died in the most splendid way. And it is that memory which we take from the battle that immediately inspired the Athenians and other Greeks, and then latterly has inspired many of us since.
You alluded to you said molon lave, which is a heroic term becoming controversial. And unfortunately, some of us have seen, let's talk about some contemporary views of Thermopylae. We've seen some of the most reprehensible figures nowadays, especially white supremacists, try to adopt Thermopylae as their own. Wrongly, I'll make my view wrongly, because they focus on a battle or a military culture and narrowly focus on that, where Sparta, and this is, we're going back to our discussion on Lycurgus, it was a constitutional system. It was, one of my favorite quotes. And again, you start your book in Spartans, go tell the Spartans, strangers passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Sparta was a rule of law society as well. But, I know you feel strongly about this. Give us a rebuke to the people who are misappropriating the Spartans and Thermopylae.
Well, I suppose the phrase white supremacy says it all. I'm an anti-racist, so I'm not thrilled with that notion. I'm also an anti-fascist, and I have a very dear friend in Berkeley whose brother was killed by the occupying Nazis. He's from Sparta, my friend, and he wrote a fictionalized version of that unfortunate, shall we say, episode. So there is a very strong tradition of resistance based on Greek culture to that sort of racism and fascism. So it's very unfortunate that Golden Dawn has made use of Thermopylae, that gun clubs in the States use molon labe as their slogan or motto.
Well, and it's up to us to, and this is why we celebrate these battles, as the ambassador said, and why I urge everybody to read the full story, because the full story lets you know how important law was, how important being civilized was. Frankly, you referred to it, Professor, that the Spartans were fighting for freedom against despotism, whereas a lot of these others are really encourage, especially the neo-fascists, despotism. Or as the Metropolitan of Chicago makes a remark to, he has a quote, says, how one died matters as much as how one lived. And that's exactly part of the lesson. But so we can celebrate this properly, I referred to your books, and I will, for people who are just tuning in, You should go read Thermopylae and the Spartans by the professor. We're lucky to have him. Stephen Pressfield, my favorite novel of all time, The Gates of Fire. And Barry Strauss, the author of the Battle of Salamis, who you dedicated the Spartans
I
to.
did, yeah. Dear friend of mine.
You know, we have the rest of this year to celebrate, and I think learning the full history is important. Can you give us some reading recommendations, including which is your favorite version of the Father of History? It's the first work of written history, Herodotus.
It's a little bit embarrassing to ask me because I've actually contributed with another dear friend, Tom Holland, who wrote a book called Persian Fire about these events. I recommend that hugely. Tom Holland undertook to learn ancient Greek in order to translate Herodotus. Now, not many people can say that. So we published together in 2013 a translation, utterly brand new, unlike any other, with Penguin Press. Now, purists among us might think that some of that language, i.e. Tom Holland's English, is a little bit free. It's a little bit removed from the original of Herodotus. Herodotus actually was rather a concise writer, and Tom's English is a little bit, shall we say, expansive. So my favorite, as it were, traditional translation is an 1890, but reissued by New York Review of Books translation by a man called George Macaulay. 1890, George Macaulay, reissued New York Review of Books.
And Persian Fire is really awesome, and it's actually a great first read before you read Spartans and even Thermopylae, because it gives you the background of the Persian Empire. I want to stick on books before we finish, because besides your books on the Spartans, we read your book on Alexander the Great. You did a great book on the Battle of Plataea, which, again, embarrassingly too few people know, since that was the ultimate land victory, on democracy. But you have a new book coming out on Thebes. And since you referred to Thebes, give us a little preview, because we're looking forward to when all this social distancing ends, that we have you back in the United States again, and you can present the book on Thebes. Tell us a little bit about it.
So I chose to write Thebes for two main reasons. One, it is the third most important single city in the whole of the ancient Greek world, and it's relatively well documented. And the but is, of course, because of its role in the Persian wars we've been talking about today, partly directly because of that, it acquired a very negative reputation in ancient Greece. And so when Alexander the Great, before he conquered the Persian Empire, he had to conquer mainland Greece so that his rear was secure, so that when he went off to Asia, there wouldn't be a rebellion in his backyard. Well, the Thebans resisted him with the Athenians. And you might think, great, they were both democracies. They were. But Alexander was able to use the way the Thebans had behaved in 480 and 479 against them to gain support among ordinary Greeks for what he did to Thebes. He actually ordered that it be destroyed, root and branch, with only two exceptions. All the religious shrines, he was very religious, Alexander. He wanted the gods on his side, all of them. And secondly, the house of Pindar, he said, don't destroy that, because Pindar was a great Greek. He wrote these wonderful praise poems for victors in the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Pythian Games, the Pan-Hellenic, all Greek games. So I wanted, on the one hand, to do justice to Thebes historically, so the historical city of Thebes, and actually one of my heroes, one of my all-time heroes, is a Theban. He's called Epaminondas, and he lived in the 4th century BC, not long before Alexander. Actually, he died just 6 years before Alexander was born. Then the other reason is Thebes as a city of myth, as a city of story. And so the Thebans had their own epic cycle. They feature strongly in Homer. They produced these amazing poems. Pindar was a Theban. And then on the basis of them, they generated some of the greatest plays, some of the greatest tragedies that have ever been written. They were written by Athenians, for Athenians, but they involved stories based on Thebes. Famously, Oedipus, therefore Antigone, the 7 against Thebes, the Bacchae, the Bacchantes. These are all Theban plays. So where would we be? Where would the tradition of Western theatre be without Thebes? So I've tried to do my best for Thebes.
Well, we absolutely look forward to having you to talk about Thebes and to continue celebrating this year around the world, even virtually. And I'm sure you're going to play a role in celebrating next year's bicentennial. Thank you for being such a great representative in promoting Hellenism the way you do. I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador Papadopoulos to kind of wrap up the session and remind everybody, Wednesday we have Stephen Pressfeld, and Friday we have Barry Strauss, and this is just going to be a kickoff to the rest of the year, and I'm sure we'll be talking to Professor Cartledge again. Ambassador, it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor. It was a fascinating discussion, really. I have read your book, The Spartans, and I'm looking forward to the book about Thebes because Epaminondas, it's very, I have a fond soft for Epaminondas. So I'm looking forward to reading your book when it is out. You know, there was a lot of discussion about the parallel between the Second World War and the Greek resistance and what happened in Thermopylae. And I want to relate a personal story, which is, I think, very common to all of Greeks of my generation, whose fathers fought in the Second World War. My father was a young army cadet. He had to fight, when the Nazis entered Greece, after fascists were defeated in Albania, the Nazis entered Greece. So everybody knew that this is a lost war, but they fought. So the young cadets were taken to the battlefield and then to the island of Crete. And of course, he was prisoner of war, and etc., etc. So later I asked him very many times why you fought. I mean, it was finished. You knew that you couldn't resist the Nazi army. It was finished. And he said, you have to fight for what you believe in. You have to live by your rules. And it doesn't matter whether you die or live. What it matters is that you're not ashamed of yourself. And I think all Greeks heard that from their parents and grandparents who fought in the Second World War. And this is the true meaning of what happened in Thermopylae. Strategically, it was Salamis that was the big battle. And this is the strategic genius of Themistocles, and that changed the course of war. But the message, the moral message, is that you have to live in a way that you are not ashamed of yourself. And thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Eddie. It was really fascinating listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.
Yes.
Yes.